The air inside the old storage room felt colder than the winter outside. Dust hovered in slow motion, disturbed only by the thin beam of a ceiling bulb that flickered with the same stuttering hesitation as a fading memory. It was the kind of place where time sagged, where cardboard boxes and sealed evidence bags behaved like relics instead of records. Within the quiet, something waited, not the dramatic kind of presence, nothing loud or cruel, just a lingering weight that clung to objects left untouched for decades. Near the back, on a shelf warped from years of neglect, rested the folder that had started everything. Mariel Dane, age 27. A name that once carried promise, now reduced to faded ink and brittle paper. She had been a geology student, local volunteer, part-time archivist at the county library. Known for her calm voice and steady manner, a woman whose life never hinted at the abrupt ending she met in October 1986, somewhere along the northern outskirts of Willow Ridge, Colorado. The case file felt colder than the room when investigator Elias Rourke touched it again. He stood still for a moment, letting the silence settle around him, the way a person might pause before opening a long-forgotten letter. His breath came out faintly, almost like he feared disturbing the air. He had not been the original investigator. He had been a young deputy then, the kind who listened more than he spoke, the kind who was told to observe rather than act. But he remembered the case in fragments, the quiet seriousness of the detectives, the soft murmur of radios, the stillness of the forest where Mariel had been found. No dramatic destruction, no loud event, just silence. A life that stopped without sending out ripples. Most cases left a trace, a path, a reason. This one did not. Mariel had been discovered near a narrow ravine, her belongings arranged in a way that suggested she might have paused to take notes. A notebook with neat handwriting, a field bag, a jacket folded next to a tree stump. The scene looked almost peaceful, except for the fact that she never left it alive. Time had eaten away at the details. Witness statements faded, photos warped. Investigators came and left. By 1992, the file was sealed and pushed into storage, where it stayed, year after year, quietly aging. Now, standing in that dim room, Elias lifted the folder and let the weight settle into his hands. It was heavier than he remembered. Or perhaps he was older, old enough to feel the quiet burden of something unfinished. He stepped to the small metal table near the center of the room. The light above hummed softly, its faint buzzing the only sound cutting through the stillness. When he opened the file, the first page shifted under his fingertips, the texture rough, the faint scent of old paper mixing with dust. The first photograph stared up at him. Mariel's last known moment, not a picture of her but of her surroundings, tall grass, a narrow creek, stones arranged as though someone had been careful with them, nothing dramatic, nothing staged, just a place where silence had settled too early. Elias studied it the way a person stares at a forgotten memory, trying to find something familiar inside unfamiliar shapes. The case was unsolved, yes, but not because it was impossible. It had simply slipped through the cracks, buried under newer cases, louder events, shifting priorities. He whispered something under his breath, not a statement, not a conclusion, just a quiet breath of acknowledgement. "Mariel, let's see what we missed." His voice felt small in the room. The dust continued drifting, unbothered by his presence. And for a moment it seemed as though the old case breathed again, a faint stirring from a life cut short, waiting to be understood. Case reopens due to discovery of new crucial evidence. It began with a box that shouldn't have existed. 3 weeks earlier, while the county facility was being reorganized, a janitor discovered a small evidence container tucked behind a broken shelf. It wasn't labeled, not officially. Just a number etched faintly on the front, a number matching Mariel's case. Inside were 3 items. 1. A slide of soil particles. 2. A narrow strip of fabric, pale blue, frayed along one edge. 3. A field photograph with a blurred figure in the background, someone investigators had never identified. Originally, none of this had made it into the official file. A clerical oversight, they'd called it, but something about the fabric strip bothered the forensic team enough to flag it. And that was why Elias was back here, standing in the forgotten room, reopening something the county had long accepted as closed. He placed the newly found items beside the older documents and studied them with a calm, methodical eye. The soil slide was labeled with coordinates that didn't match the documented location of Mariel's discovery. Not by much, only a short distance, but enough to matter. Elias paused there, letting the detail settle in his thoughts. Small inconsistencies had a way of unraveling years of assumptions. He'd learned that over the decades, that truth sometimes hid inside the smallest deviation, the narrowest gap between 2 notes in a file. He lifted the strip of fabric, lightweight, weathered but not ruined. It looked like it could have been part of a sleeve or a pocket lining, something delicate, something that might belong to someone who moved quietly. The photograph, though, that was something else entirely. A blurred silhouette behind a cluster of trees, almost invisible unless you knew to look. The figure's posture seemed hesitant, turned slightly away, as if debating whether to step forward or retreat. Elias frowned slightly. The gesture was faint, barely there, but it suggested a presence at the scene that investigators had been unaware of. Someone who stood at the edge of the moment without being seen. He leaned back in his chair. The room seemed to shift around him, the dust now settling as though listening. He spoke softly, fragmented words shaped more by habit than intention. Someone was there, someone close. With the evidence laid out, the decision had felt inevitable: reopen the file. The district office approved it with quiet efficiency. Old cases didn't often receive new attention, but this one had a sense of incompleteness, an unfinished line in a report. Elias signed the authorization in steady handwriting. Now, standing alone again, he reviewed the new items piece by piece, imagining them as small signals from a past event trying to surface. He felt no rush, no dramatic pressure, only a slow, steady pull to understand what had been overlooked. Outside, the wind shifted. Inside, he turned the photograph over. On the back, faint pencil marks indicated an attempt to categorize it. Unconfirmed presence, further review needed. The note was unsigned. He exhaled slowly. Something about that small absence, no initials, no timestamp, unsettled him more than the blurred silhouette. Who wrote it? Why wasn't it logged? And why was the box hidden behind a shelf, rather than filed with the rest of the materials? Questions formed quietly, without urgency, like ripples in still water. This wasn't just a reopened case. It was a doorway into mistakes made long ago, mistakes that were neither intentional nor malicious, just silent, human oversights that built themselves into a barrier. And now that barrier had a crack. Investigator examines past reports to identify overlooked details. Elias moved to the next stack of documents, statements, maps, technical notes, transcripts of short interviews. Each sheet carried a faint yellow tint, the slow discoloration of 39 years of storage. He read carefully, the way a person listens to a quiet voice. The first report detailed the discovery of Mariel's belongings. Everything appeared orderly, almost too orderly. Her notebook lay open to a page describing rock strata near the ridge. Her handwriting was precise, almost gentle, the kind that suggested calm thought rather than distress. He traced the lines with a fingertip, not to touch but to sense. There were no signs of disturbance mentioned in the original report. No scuffle, no hurried movement. It made the case so difficult back then, no visible cause, no clear intention. Next came the interview with the two hikers who found her. Their words were simple, hesitant. "We saw her bag first, thought she might be nearby. Then we noticed she wasn't moving." The language was plain, almost formal, as though the weight of the moment had stripped emotion from their sentences. Elias could almost hear their voices, soft, uncertain, careful. Yet something in the transcript struck him. One of the hikers mentioned an unusual scent in the air, faint, like old metal heated by sun. The detail wasn't followed up. It sat there, a single line in a paragraph, overlooked. Elias underlined it lightly with his pencil. Small details mattered. He moved to the next report, the preliminary field sketch of the area. The drawn contours depicted trees, rocks, the creek and Mariel's belongings. But as he compared the sketch with the newly discovered soil coordinates, he noticed a discrepancy. The documented location was the wind along the ridge shifted as Elias stepped back into the present-day field site. Snow had gathered thinly over the years, smoothing the edges of stone and soil as though the landscape itself had tried to forget what had happened here. He paused at the crest, scanning the quiet sweep of land below. Nothing appeared unusual, nothing suggested conflict, but that had always been the strange part. A life ended here without leaving chaos behind. He crouched near the creek where Mariel's belongings had once rested, letting his fingers glide above the frozen surface without touching it. The cold radiated upward, steady, indifferent. This place held no echoes of struggle, no loud memory, only stillness. A stillness that matched the nature of the suspects he was now forced to revisit, not dramatic figures, not the kind of people one imagines in stories of wrongdoing. They were quiet individuals with quiet lives, each connected to Mariel in ways subtle enough to overlook yet strong enough to matter. He opened his notebook and reviewed the original list. 1. Jonah Redden, a fellow graduate student in geology. Their colleagues had described him as thoughtful, restrained, meticulous. He and Mariel had collaborated on several field surveys. No personal conflicts recorded. He had been the one to last see her on campus 2 days before she went into the ridge. His alibi, in Denver attending a seminar. Travel logs confirmed it, though only loosely. Elias looked at Jonah's old interview transcript. The tone was composed, almost too measured. "Jonah, she was focused. I didn't notice anything unusual." The lack of elaboration struck Elias now. Not suspicion, just a void. People often remembered small behaviors, stray expressions. Jonah offered none. A detail that once seemed normal now felt slightly off. 2. Lucille Hart, Mariel's supervisor at the library. A practical woman, organized, disciplined. She had been fond of Mariel, though interviews suggested she didn't know her deeply. She claimed Mariel left work early the day before the ridge visit, saying she wanted to clear her head. Lucille's alibi placed her at a regional cataloging conference. Verified. Multiple witnesses confirmed she was present, yet something stuck out in her file. An unsigned memo Mariel wrote for the library archives referencing misplaced documents and inconsistencies in categorization. It wasn't clear what she was referring to. The memo ended abruptly, mid-sentence. Elias made a note, clarify nature of inconsistencies. 3. Ben Marrow, a forest ranger who patrolled the northern ridge. He had been one of the first responders in 1986, appearing calm and cooperative. His field logs showed he was on routine rounds the day Mariel entered the area. No witnesses placed him directly near the ravine, but his patrol route passed within a mile. He had said something brief, almost whispered during his initial statement. "Ben, people come out here for quiet. Sometimes they find more than they want." It wasn't incriminating, just reflective. Yet Elias underlined it in his notebook. The ranger had known the terrain intimately. Too intimately, perhaps. If someone wanted to approach unnoticed, they would need knowledge of the ridge's quieter paths. 4. A fourth unnamed figure. The blurred silhouette in the newly found photo. This individual hadn't been listed originally, their presence assumed to be irrelevant or perhaps dismissed as a trick of the light. Now the figure's existence mattered. Elias studied the photo again. The posture was cautious, half turned away, not confident, not aggressive, someone present but uncertain. He let the image sit on his palm, studying the faint outline of a shoulder, the tilt of the head. The figure was too indistinct to identify but too intact to ignore. These four threads, Jonah, Lucille, Ben, and the unknown figure, created a web of possibilities. Not dramatic, not explosive, just a quiet network of human behaviors and subtle motivations. Elias closed his notebook softly. The strength of this case would not come from confessions or bold discoveries. It would come from small cracks in these alibis, faint inconsistencies, the gentle pressure of logic applied over time. He stood, letting the cold wind fold around him, and turned back toward the trail. The footsteps he left behind were crisp and narrow, forming a pattern across the snow that vanished quickly as more flakes began to fall. Clues emerged slowly, linking inconsistencies to emotional conflicts. The office felt smaller now, the walls lined with files forming narrow corridors of silent history. Elias set the photos in a neat row and rested the new evidence beside them. The room smelled faintly of dust and time-worn paper, an atmosphere that encouraged careful thought, not urgency. He began with the soil slide. Under a small field microscope, the particles revealed themselves, fine grains mixed with microfragments of quartz, normal for this region, but something else clung to the edges. A faint residue, a mineral compound rarely found in the northern ridge, more common near the abandoned quarry farther west. That quarry hadn't been part of Mariel's recorded route. He noted it quietly. Soil suggests movement near quarry. Next came the fabric strip. It was pale blue, slightly textured, woven from a blend common in lightweight jackets from the mid-80s. But Mariel's jacket, according to the records, had been brown canvas. This fabric belonged to someone else. Possibly someone who stood near her. Possibly someone who brushed against a branch or rock close to where she worked. He held the fabric between tweezers and turned it carefully. A faint smell, not unpleasant, simply distinct, lingered. Something like sun-warmed cotton mixed with the scent of storage. He set it down gently. The clues were small, whisper-light, but each one pointed toward presence, someone near Mariel at a moment when she was believed to be alone. He moved to the next document, the incomplete memo Mariel had written. Inconsistent sequence found, not matching catalog, unsure if deliberate or. The sentence ended there, unresolved. Elias traced the faded pencil line where the words cut off. He imagined Mariel sitting at her desk, writing carefully, pausing because something interrupted her thoughts, or perhaps because she wasn't sure how to continue. What inconsistency had she found? Had she come to the ridge to check something related to her library work? He turned to the librarian's statements again. Lucille had mentioned Mariel being distracted, but no one asked what she had been researching. No one asked what documents she had been reorganizing. Elias reached for the library's archived logbook. Inside, he found the entry. Mariel assigned to reorganize local historical field notes from 1960–1980. He turned the pages slowly. Field notes, geology reports, survey maps. And then he found it, a single folder labeled Quarry Reclamation 1974. Paper edges brittle, ink faint, but the contents were intact. Inside were early survey maps of the ridge area, drawn by different teams across multiple years. Comparing them side by side revealed something unspoken. The boundary of the quarry excavation had shifted several times in small increments, each shift going unremarked, meaning someone had been altering the recorded borders. Mariel, detail-oriented archivist, might have noticed. And if she did, she might have gone to the ridge to verify something. Elias continued reading. Near the back of the folder was a small note written in hurried handwriting. Document mismatch. Possible route mislabel. Must review access trails. Unsigned. Faint pencil pressure. A writing style that did not match Mariel's. He lifted the note closer. The strokes were uneven, the kind written during field conditions rather than at a desk. His eyes drifted to the blurred photograph again. Was the blurred figure the writer? He placed the note next to Ben Marrow's old Ranger logs. Ben's handwriting was neat, methodical, deliberate, not a match. Jonah's course notes showed small, compact letters, not a match either. Lucille rarely wrote in pencil. Her notes were typed. The handwriting belonged to someone unlisted, someone who had been on site in the 70s or 80s, someone Mariel might have tried to find. He leaned back slowly. The quiet of the room pressed around him. The pattern forming was not one of dramatic conflict but quiet friction, subtle disagreements, small withheld facts, unspoken hesitations. Emotional terrain, not loud or stormy but still potent. Jonah's silence. Lucille's vague comment. Ben's reflective statement. The unknown figure's presence. Each of them intersected with Mariel in ways they hadn't expressed clearly. Elias returned to the quarry maps. He noticed something small. An access trail used in the 70s had been quietly removed from the newer charts, not officially erased, simply not carried forward. Mariel, comparing records, would have seen that discrepancy. She might have gone looking for the old trail. She might have walked through that path on the day she died. He leaned forward, elbows resting gently on the table, and whispered inaudibly. She followed the map. There it was, the emotional link. Curiosity. Responsibility. A need to understand. Mariel had never been reckless, but she valued accuracy. And accuracy, in this case, led her to a forgotten trail where someone else had once walked. Possibly someone who didn't want that path remembered. The clues were no longer scattered. They were beginning to align. Slowly, quietly, logically. Unexpected twist reveals the least suspected person as killer. Elias sat alone as the evening settled into deeper quiet. His desk lamp cast a faint circle of light, the edges soft, blurring into the surrounding dimness. He spread the remaining photos out, each image forming its own silent territory. He looked at the suspects again, in the same analytical order. Jonah distant, careful but not deceptive. Lucille orderly, distracted but not connected to the ridge. Ben familiar with the terrain but expressing no conflict, no hidden tension. He exhaled. Each had small inconsistencies, yes, but none contained the underlying thread that matched the new clues. He returned to the fabric strip, pale blue, and then to a photo of Mariel in the library archives, standing near a shelf with her colleague, Ruth Kellen, the senior archivist. Ruth had only been interviewed briefly. Her role seemed peripheral, limited to managing old records. Her file sat at the bottom of the stack, barely half a page. She'd been working in the archives that same week. She wore a pale blue jacket in the photograph. Elias froze for a moment, then leaned closer without rushing. He unfolded Ruth's old statement. "I didn't see Mariel the morning she left. She seemed fine the day before. We talked about the weather, I think." Short, simple, almost empty. He retrieved the library, shelving assignments from that week. Ruth had been assigned to the same archival section, where Mariel found the map inconsistencies. A small shift in perspective aligned the facts. Ruth wore pale blue often. Ruth handled those same quarry files. Ruth had access to older maps. Ruth had been at the library the same morning Mariel left. Elias lifted the fabric strip again. He imagined a moment Mariel reaching into a shelf, Ruth leaning in beside her, fabric catching on a splintered edge. Nothing dramatic, just a small contact. Then he examined the handwriting in the quarry notes again, comparing each curve, each slant. He pulled out a staff form from Ruth's file. Her signature looped in the same narrow tilt as the pencil notes. The match was quiet but clear. Ruth had gone to the ridge once, decades ago. She had walked the old trail. She had written the note. And if Mariel discovered the boundary inconsistencies, Ruth might have feared an inquiry. Not panic-driven, just quiet, incremental fear, the kind that builds slowly. A logic formed. Ruth followed Mariel. They spoke near the ridge. A confrontation, not violent but tense. A fall. An accident. A moment too heavy to admit. And Ruth, restrained by silence, had let time bury the truth. The twist was not violent, not elaborate, just devastating in its smallness. Ruth, the calm archivist, overlooked by everyone, held the final piece, slightly to the north of where the soil sample indicated. Only a few yards, but enough to shift perspective. Enough to change who might have been able to approach unseen. He paused again, letting the silence settle. Then came a file marked peripheral witnesses. Inside were short statements from locals who were near the ridge that week. Most recalled nothing unusual. A few mentioned hearing distant footsteps or glimpsing someone walking near the tree line. Nothing conclusive, nothing connected. But in the very last statement, barely half a page, a librarian from Mariel's workplace mentioned something easily dismissed. She'd been reorganizing the archives. She mentioned finding something confusing but didn't say more. She seemed thoughtful, maybe a little distracted. Elias read the line twice. Mariel had been an archivist, a person familiar with details, with order, with quiet observation. If something had bothered her, it might not have been dramatic. It could have been something small enough to escape notice, yet significant enough to draw her attention on the day she left for the ridge. He leaned back in his chair, eyes closed briefly. The old storage room smelled faintly of paper and dust, but beneath that he sensed something else, the weight of all the small, overlooked pieces coming together. His notes formed a pattern. Incorrect coordinates. A blurred silhouette. A missing signature. A lone observation about Mariel's distracted mood. the newly discovered fabric strip. None of it dramatic, none of it loud, but together they created a shift, a quiet tilt in the narrative. He opened his eyes again and looked at Mariel's photograph. She stood near a set of shelves in the library, a faint smile that wasn't posed. Her expression suggested patience, curiosity, the kind of calm that made her well-liked yet easy to overlook. Someone like that didn't attract chaos, but she might notice something others didn't. And that, Elias realized, was the detail everyone missed in 1986. Not what happened to her, but why she had gone to the ridge that day. He set down the photo. The light above him flickered again, almost as though responding to the moment. The case wasn't reopening because of new evidence alone. It was reopening because the old evidence had been read the wrong way, or not read deeply enough. And now, slowly, deliberately, the story was beginning to shift. Night settled over the county building in a slow, measured descent. Streetlights outside cast pale circles across the pavement. Their glow felt more than seen through the frosted windows. Inside, the hallway was silent, long and nearly hollow. Elias walked it slowly, holding the reconstructed case file against his chest with careful hands, as though carrying something fragile, not the papers themselves, but the quiet truth inside them. He stepped into the evidence room once more. The same dust floated in the air, drifting like faint particles of memory. He set the file on the metal table and let it open naturally, the pages unfolding with a soft whisper. The photographs, the transcripts, the fabric strip, the maps, all lay arranged, no longer a scattered history, but a single muted line leading toward a conclusion no one had seen coming. He pulled Ruth Kellen's file forward. Her jacket in the photo, her handwriting, her access to the quarry documents, her proximity to Mariel's archival work. None of it flashy, none of it loud, just small threads woven so lightly into the background that the investigators in 1986 never saw them. He leaned in, elbows resting on the table, studying the details with a calm, steady gaze. He didn't feel triumph. This case carried no room for that. Instead, he felt a subdued awareness, a sense of alignment between past and present. The logic had revealed what emotion had hidden. He opened the field reports from 1986 again. In the original diagram of the ravine, there was nothing to suggest struggle. Mariel's posture had been described as peaceful, almost seated. One investigator had even noted she looked restfully placed, as though she had paused to write and simply never resumed. But now, with the new context, Elias could reinterpret the scene. Mariel had taken the older map with her. She walked the forgotten trail. Near the ridge, she likely confirmed the boundary inconsistencies. And at some point, perhaps while comparing notes or kneeling to examine the soil, she wasn't alone. Ruth must have followed. Not in anger or desperation, more likely in worry. A fear of consequences so quiet it almost didn't count as fear. Ruth was older than Mariel by nearly a decade. She had been responsible for maintaining the archives for years. If Mariel discovered something that looked like mismanagement or worse, falsification, Ruth's career could have been brought into question. Small stakes by some standards, but personal stakes run on private scales. The confrontation, if one could call it that, probably held no shouting, no dramatic gestures. Elias pictured it the way the evidence suggested, the murmur of two quiet voices, standing among the tall grass and the wind. Ruth explaining something, Mariel listening, perhaps stepping back, perhaps turning. A slip near the ravine was enough. The edge wasn't steep, but the terrain was uneven. A single misplaced step could send someone down at the wrong angle. The original forensics noted no aggressive force, no blunt trauma suggesting intent, just a fall that ended too soon. Ruth might have climbed down after her, might have tried to help, might have stood there in shock, realizing what the moment meant. It wasn't what she did next that mattered. It was what she didn't do. She didn't report it. She didn't call for help. She didn't come forward. Instead, she removed the map from Mariel's bag, the map marked with her own handwriting. She left everything else undisturbed, letting the scene look as unintentional as it felt. Then she returned to the library, filed the quarry folder back into place, said nothing. And the case, stripped of motive or conflict, quietly faded into the cold. Elias let that image settle in the space between his thoughts. A quiet misstep, a quiet fear, a quiet decision. He wrote a note for the district report, factual, concise. Evidence suggests accidental fall with secondary concealment of context. He did not use accusations. He did not assign cruel intent. The truth did not require it. He turned off the desk lamp. The room dimmed to a muted glow shaped only by the hallway light. The next morning, Elias visited the library before it opened. Snow had layered itself thinly across the front steps, the kind of snow that seemed soft but carried a quiet finality. Inside, the archive room felt smaller than he remembered, rows of shelves close together, aisles narrow and quiet. Ruth stood at the center table, sorting through a stack of catalog cards with the same steady rhythm she'd likely used for decades. She looked up when Elias entered, her expression calm, polite, almost relieved to see him. "Investigator Rourke," she said quietly, a small pause. "Is this about the old case again?" Her voice held no tremor, no sign of panic. Only resignation, the gentle kind that builds over years, not days. Elias stepped closer. He set the fabric strip on the table. She looked at it for 3 seconds, then closed her eyes briefly, like someone recognizing an old song from the first soft notes. "Is it time?" she asked softly. He nodded. Her shoulders lowered, but not in collapse, more like someone settling into a truth she had carried alone for too long. She didn't confess, not directly. She didn't offer long explanations or memories. She didn't need to. She simply whispered she wasn't supposed to get hurt. The silence afterward felt heavier than the words. Elias didn't push for details. He didn't ask for a reconstruction of the moment. The evidence already explained the shape of it. His role wasn't to extract emotion, only clarity. Ruth folded her hands in front of her and stared at the shelf behind him, eyes unfocused. "It happened quickly," she said, "and then slowly, if that makes sense." It did. He gave her a moment, then quietly escorted her from the room. The library remained still behind them, the paper smell lingering like the past itself trying to exhale. The official proceedings were orderly. Ruth faced administrative review, legal assessment, and eventual charges related to concealment. Nothing harsh, nothing sensational. The county understood the nature of the case, a decades-old event with no clear malice, only a devastating outcome and a long silence. For the Dane family, closure came quietly. Elias met them in a small conference room where the windows looked out over the snowdrift behind the building. Mariel's brother sat with hands clasped, staring at the manila folder Elias placed before him. "We knew she wasn't reckless," he said after a while. "We always believed something didn't add up." Elias nodded slowly. She followed a detail she couldn't ignore. The family didn't ask for graphic explanations. They asked only for honesty. He gave them that in calm, gentle fragments, shaped by logic rather than emotion. When the meeting ended, Mariel's brother thanked him with a subtle, tired nod. "Truth," he said, "sometimes hides in quiet places." Elias looked down at the table. "It does." Weeks later, after the county finalized its documentation, Elias returned to the ridge alone one last time. Snow softened every edge, the wind low and murmuring. He walked the old trail Mariel must have followed, the trail Ruth had once taken decades before. Each step felt deliberate, shaped by the weight of what had finally surfaced. He reached the ravine and stood silently at its frozen edge, hands in his pockets, breath slow and even. The creek below whispered beneath thin ice, moving with calm persistence. Nothing about the place betrayed its history. It remained ordinary, achingly, hauntingly ordinary. He knelt, brushing the snow aside until a patch of dark soil revealed itself. The ground felt steady, quiet, old. There was no satisfaction in knowing the truth, no surge of relief, only a muted understanding that the past had finally stopped hiding. He whispered into the open air, a barely audible exhale. She saw something small, and it mattered. He let the moment settle. The sun began to rise behind the ridge, casting a pale, fragile light across the quiet landscape. The scene looked almost unchanged from the old photographs. The same grass, the same stones, the same stillness. Yet something was different. Not the place, not the evidence, but the weight of knowing. Truth, Elias realized, rarely arrived with force. More often it drifted in like dust, slow, subtle, settling over years until the outline of events finally became clear. He stood, stepped back from the ravine and faced the quiet forest. Snow continued falling, small and steady, covering the ground in a thin, reflective layer. Justice, he thought, was much the same, a process of small steps, careful pieces, surfaces examined and re-examined until something once invisible came into focus. Not perfect, not loud, simply present. As he turned to leave, the landscape behind him remained calm, unchanged in appearance, unchanged in silence. But he carried with him a final understanding, a quiet conclusion shaped not by triumph, but by clarity. The truth had always been there. It had just been buried under the softest details. And as the wind moved gently across the ridge, Elias let the case rest. Its final pages quietly closed, but never erased, proof that even in forgotten places, something human endures.